Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session called, rather apocalyptically, The Death of the Critic. My income immediately plummets. My name is Alan Taylor, and I'm the editor of the Scottish Review of Books, and I'm going to be chairing this session. We are one person down, you might have noticed. There was a much keener gender balance, but Joyce McMillan has, alas, been indisposed.
Too many plays.
Too many plays, yes. I think at the last count she'd only seen about 70 so far. So that's what it's like to be a critic out there in the kind of circus that is the festival. I should just give you a little bit of background to this session. As I said, I'm the editor of the Scottish Review of Books, and in association with Creative Scotland, we're running a project called Emerging Critics. The idea is to try and find a new generation of critics in the so-called digital age. And I've been joined here by three eminent critics and writers who are also, strangely enough, novelists. Each one of them has written novels. But just a word about criticism. There's going to be three of these events. There's this one here, and there's going to be others in Dundee and Glasgow. So if you're a glutton for punishment, you might like to attend those two. But here we are in the midst of this great festival with hundreds of events, and who but critics can help you sort the wheat from the chaff, the Abraham Lincolns, I suppose, from the Donald Trumps.
Fairly straightforward, I would have thought.
Whenever you see critics mentioned, the words that accompany them are never complimentary. You know, they're usually called something like a swarm of critics, or they're called lice, or things like that. You know, just not very nice things are said about them. Sibelius, I think it was said, you probably know this better than I do, Jim. Sibelius said that there were no statues to critics, whereas Brendan Behan said, critics are like eunuchs in a harem. Or harem. They know how it's done, they've seen it done every day, but they're unable to do it themselves. The format is that each of our panelists here is going to speak for 5-6 minutes. That is Mr. Naughtie here on my right, not the far right, but he's on the right. You know him of old, of course. He's had a career that's been sort of plummeting ever since he left The Scotsman. It's never gone right since then. He is a novelist, a political writer, and a very, very fine broadcaster. On my left-hand side here is Dan Gunn, who is an expert in Samuel Beckett, has just come to the end of 4 years of editing Beckett, 40 years of, 25 years of editing, 4 volumes.
Get it right, Taylor, come on.
This is the trouble when you have a broadcaster of this ilk. By the way, the crisps will be made clear in a minute. Dan is also a novelist. He published last year The Emperor of Ice Cream, a rather wonderful and ambitious novel set amongst the Italian community in Edinburgh. And he's a professor at the American University in Paris. And on the far left, on, as it were, the sort of Jeremy Corbyn wing of the platform, is Rosemary Goring, who I personally know quite well. She is the literary editor of 3 newspapers here, the Herald, the Sunday Herald, and the National. Which I guess makes her an extraordinarily powerful person in the diminishing world of book publishing, and that she may not actually have a job very soon if this session's title is anything to go by. Yes. So we're going to kick off, first of all, with Jim here. As I said, they're going to talk for 5 or 6 minutes. If he goes over that, I will shake the crisps like this.
Ah, right.
And if he goes seriously over it, I'll start to crunch the crisps. At which point, Jim, you know, there's the time to stop.
Okay.
Okay, so please welcome Jim Naughtie.
Right, thank you. Being the Edinburgh Book Festival, International Book Festival, a minute or two ago I ran into an extremely distinguished writer in the tent, who's also, well, in the yard really, who's also been a critic over many years. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I explained this session. And he said, "What's it called?" And I said, "It's called The Death of the Critic." And he said, "In my view, there are too many of them still alive." So we begin with that. A couple of observations. One is, and Alan's kind of alluded to this, is that we all know that there's been an extraordinary diminution in the place afforded to literary, musical, and other forms of criticism in the serious press, in our memory. When I was in the Scotsman in the late 70s, early 80s, when Alan Wright, as editor of the Arts Pages, used to plan the review coverage of the festival, it was like preparing for D-Day.
Absolutely, yes.
It was an extraordinary operation. Now, there is still serious criticism in that paper, and of course Joyce, who's not with us today, has been flying the flag for proper theatre criticism in Scotland for ages. There's music criticism, and people like Ken Walton and Michael Tumulty in Glasgow and so on still do exactly what the critics have always done about serious pieces of work. But we also know that it shrunk hugely. You have to fight to get stuff in. It's shorter. It's less comprehensive. If you look at the pages of the main UK broadsheets, the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian, the space devoted to criticism of the arts in general has just diminished to a tiny amount. And if you look back to the days when great critics, although they would still always complain about the space they got, don't we all the time as journalists, that's the nature of life, they would get space that reflected a belief in the institution that this kind of commentary, analysis, opinion was important, and it was an absolutely central part of the paper's purpose to do it. As far as I can tell, the editors of the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian are actually no longer interested in that at all. Now, if they were here, they would be no doubt defending their position. I know the people who work on the arts pages in these papers are all in despair about the space they get, about the encouragement they get, and about the feeling that it's regarded as an add-on that might please a few people who might otherwise write an awkward letter to the editor, but that it's not seen as a central part of the paper. So we've seen that happen. On the other hand, it's ludicrous to say that criticism doesn't exist. The internet has produced, an absolute plethora of blogs and spaces where you can go and search for things, and we all know if you're going to a performance, you can, at the click of a mouse, you can see half a dozen reviews, and they're there, and people write seriously about it. So the idea that criticism and proper analytical judgment of the artistic firmament isn't still there is clearly absurd. But what we've lost is that feeling that there's a kind of common culture represented, particularly in our written press, to which everybody somehow coheres and or is drawn, and from which people can then start a kind of discourse and conversation that spreads far beyond the readership of those newspapers. And that kind of central core, I think, was always terribly important. But there's something else, and I think it's even more fundamental than that. You can talk about the way that the position of the critic, whether we're talking about theatre, music, or anything else, film's not so bad, has been sort of diminished in the way that it's presented publicly. And I think that's beyond argument. But what you've got in its place in the explosion of argument and so-called debate on the web is something rather different. And I think that the shouting match, whether you're talking about politics in particular, or the arts, on Twitter and its associated aspects of social media, it's something that absolutely diminishes the idea of civilized argument, debate, analysis, and disagreement. Because what it substitutes for that is a kind of Donald Trump view of the world, where people are either right or wrong, black or white, good or evil. And anybody who lived through the independence referendum as a journalist knows, on whichever side you were, or alleged to be, the nature of the commentary on the web was poisonous. Well, that's fair enough, but destructive as well.
Yeah.
And if you look at what you're getting in the Labour Party with all its problems at the moment, with the kind of commentary you get, it is something that diminishes the idea of proper disagreement argued through. For that, it's substituted a kind of street brawl in words. And that is very sad. So, I mean, I just want to make 2 points coming from that. One, the surviving kind of beacons of proper critical discourse about the arts and all its associated bits in newspapers particularly needs to be defended, because that is a point to which people can come from all attitudes, and it's the beginning of a conversation. The difficulty of the disparate nature of the web and everybody going to their own little silos to read people with whom they agree is a really, really difficult one to crack. But what has to be fought is the extension through the web of the old idea that if you argue that something is good and something is bad, you are elitist. Now, nobody in this hall, in this tent, needs to be told what a ludicrous idea that is. The minute you begin to stop judging quality and arguing about it and discussing what it might be, you're lost. You end up in a kind of desert of rubbish. That's the problem with the web. The problem is that people who want to find, wonderful analysis of XYZ performance can find it there, but they're the only people who go there, and they don't share it. And somehow we've got to crack the idea that proper discussion about the values of performance, ideas, writing in the public domain needs to be kind of recovered as an absolute bulwark of our artistic and our social lives. And if you look at the diminishing number of book reviews in the heavy papers, you look at just one little aspect. The Guardian, which championed at a very, very important point, literature for children and young people, though, obviously much of it is written for older people as well, but, they did a huge amount to actually give space to writers and critics in that field. That is shrinking to almost nothing. You can find other examples of it right across the press. And I think people have got to just stand up and say this is bad and it's wrong and it's actually draining something from our culture. So the critic is not dead. The critic just needs to be given a bit more room, even if when the critic delivers his or her verdict, we want to throw every rotten vegetable in the garden in their direction.
Oh, there speaks bitter experience, I suspect. Well, Rosemary, is Jim right? I mean, 2 of the newspapers that you are the books editor of did not exist when Jim was at the Scotsman causing mayhem. So that's 2 more newspapers than did exist, and one within the Scotsman stable as well. Yeah. Scotland on Sunday didn't exist then. Scottish Review of Books didn't exist then. So is this just sort of a received wisdom that there is less criticism out there?
I think, in terms of numerically, yes, there are more newspapers, and of course there are therefore more books pages, than when Jim was initially talking about. But Jim is completely right where he talks about the tone of people at the helm, as it were, of these newspapers and the attitude towards culture and reviewing it. So although I'm delighted that the National, for example, we managed to get a Book of the Week in, and now that's a spread because the editor there is very keen that there is coverage of books, Scottish books in particular. So I see that almost as a triumph of attitude as well as actually of space. And the Sunday Herald and the Herald are both very supportive of books, but they have been cut because of declining circulation. So the picture I see is both rosy and gloomy at the same time, which is, I know that's terribly sitting on the fence, which I don't normally like doing. As a critic, you like to be quite clear-cut. But there are reasons to be optimistic, but there are an awful lot of reasons to feel really fed up about the situation as well. Alan asked me if I would just give a brief outline of reviewing from the point of view of the job I do.
Yes.
Are you happy with me to do that?
As long as you don't overdo the crisp packet factor.
They're plain crisps. I'm not at all interested. They're not. They're tomato, are they?
No, they're
No,
plain crisps.
that's fine. In which case, I don't mind if you crunch. I thought, just as you know, I run the books pages for 3 papers, and I thought I would just start by talking about what I think of as Treasure Island, which is the Herald's book cupboard, which is just an absolute heaven, not just for me, but for people who want to talk about how bad their marriages are and everything, because it's a lovely little quiet cubicle with about 250 books coming in every week. So you can imagine, first it gives you arthritis of your thumb, but also it's an absolute deluge of books from all across the spectrum. So in terms of my job, what I'm having to cover goes from obviously a heavy emphasis on Scottish books, on fiction, world fiction, obviously in English, not in the original language, children's books, poetry, biography, you know, the whole gamut of books come my way, and all the emails that come from publishers at the same time. And when you're running pages for a newspaper, you're not a highbrow literary journal. You are trying to give people a picture of the whole field, as it were. So I'm running reviews of people from James Kelman to Diana Gabaldon, or I'm not quite sure how to say that, even though I have spoken to her, and she told me how to pronounce it, but I've forgotten, I'm afraid. The second thing I wanted to mention, I consider sort of like, I'm thinking of this in terms of book titles, so we're now in this section called Scoop or Complicity, because a lot of people think that book reviewing is really an extremely effete, airy-fairy kind of job. You sit at home, you have your feet up, you have Mahler on the record player, and you've got your box of After Eight mints, and you just enjoy a very genteel, elegant sort of Edwardian life. And I can tell you, if you're reviewing a J.K. Rowling novel overnight in the space of 8 hours, that is not elegant or pleasant, and that is not easy. Basically, good book reviewing is very much a branch of journalism. We work with the same deadlines, word counts, accuracy and speed and clear writing are absolutely essential to what we do. And now, what I would say is, you know, what is a book review meant to do in a newspaper? I call this Great Expectations, because a book review is meant to do just about everything. And whenever I sit down to write one, or whenever I read one from a reviewer, my hopes are very high, and sometimes they're met, and sometimes, with my own stuff as well, they're not quite met, because a book review has to do a great deal. It is not, and I repeat, it is not a sort of a publicity wing of the publishing industry, which a lot of publishers like to think it is. We are not there to give them free advertising, and we're not there either to massage the egos of writers who always get good reviews or are enormously popular. We're not there to add to their Facebook sort of colour, as it were. A book review is meant to give a really good impressionistic idea of the book that's being discussed, obviously. It's meant to be as well written as the book that you're writing about, which is a very tall order in some cases, I know, but a badly written book review would make you think, well, why would I trust this person's judgment? If they can't write, how can they judge somebody else's writing? You're meant to give not just the flavour of the book, but also an opinion, not a cruel opinion. You have to kind of get the balance right between being fair and being honest. And I can tell you that in a small country, that is extremely difficult. I picked up my mobile phone the other morning. I'd been working, so I hadn't noticed that someone had called at 8:30, and he had left a message, and I was dreading it, because he said, I've just been reading the Scottish Review of Books. I'm working my way through it, and I got to your review of the new A.L. Kennedy novel. And he said, I thought, to begin with, you were being far too kind, and then you stuck the boot in. It was great. And you can imagine that left me sort of feeling two ways, you know, because I wasn't trying to stick the boot in. I was just trying to express reservations, I hope, you know, by sort of explaining my reservations. But I was also quite interested that readers of book reviews don't just want to be told that this is fantastic. They want to really know what a book is like. And sometimes a bad review is very good for a book, because it gets everybody talking about it. But also, I have noticed that myself as well, as a writer, a book review that is critical, you can often really respect, because you can take something from it. And I don't think there's anybody, well, maybe our panelists excluded, who has written a book who doesn't know where the bodies are buried. They know that there's something not quite right about the book somewhere. They just hope that they've done a great comb over and that nobody will actually notice it. So now I reach...
It's all right.
Pressing on. there's a big question of who are the people who review the books, and I like to think of this either as the girls of slender means or the borrowers, because you do not make a lot of money if you're making your living by being a book reviewer. And very occasionally I feel as though I'm sort of a branch of the social services, because I know the difference that a book review fee can make to somebody's life, because I know just how big their mortgage is or how big their grocery bill, and that I can tell you is some pressure. But the people who write reviews, I tend to have a stable of very reliable reviewers, and you tend to keep putting book reviews to the same people because they are so good and they are reliable, so they meet deadlines and they write within word counts, etc. So we have occasionally academics, although often academics, excuse me, Dan, are terrible book reviewers because they work in sort of geological time span, and a newspaper doesn't really accommodate that. And the other thing, again, I'm so sorry about
Remember, he gets the chance to speak
that's
last.
true. This is why I'm doing this, because
Yeah.
I think that's only fair.
Yeah.
But also there's a difference between often a book reviewer and an academic reviewer, because an academic is sort of looking for phenomena and often doesn't like to say if this is actually good or not, whereas the kind of book reviewing that I require for my pages expresses an opinion, evaluation, as it were, when Jim was talking earlier about good and bad and so on, and that's really crucial. Journalists, believe it or not, despite being part of that sort of much maligned troupe, are excellent reviewers, and not just because they know how to write for newspapers, but seem to be quite fearless often and also get to the heart of a book very well. They're very succinct. But perhaps the best reviewers, I think, are people who are just totally addicted readers and very good close readers of books. And one of my, I won't name him, but one of the best reviewers who writes for me as well as for the Scottish Review of Books is just a polymath. And I mean, he could either design a garden for you, explain, nuclear physics to you, or when he went to do his PhD, he went to live in Norway for a couple of years, and that's where he published his first novel in Norwegian. He just picked up the language when he went there. So that's the kind of person who writes book reviews for me. And just to sum up before we get to the end, I like to call this section, I'll be really quick, To Be Continued, the author of whom is actually in the audience. It's a great new novel by James Robertson. So in To Be Continued, I just wanted to say, do book reviews in newspapers actually sell books? Well, to be honest, I don't care, because that's not what our role is. It is exactly as Jim was talking about. It's about a conversation. It's about a patchwork, a cultural patchwork that you sort of build up week by week by week over the years. You're giving a snapshot of what's happening in the world of books. You're giving some kind of analysis, and basically it is a record. So although sometimes people get terrible reviews and say, my goodness, the book will never sell, it's not that actually will affect the book sales, it's how good the book is. So I shall leave To Be Continued.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Dan.
Alan mentioned that I've been working on Beckett for a long time, so I'm thinking in his terms a lot at the moment. And if some of you will remember that when he tried to translate On attendant Godot, which he wrote in French into English, he had to find an equivalent for the insults that Vladimir and Estragon exchange. And they call each other crapaud, salaud, and then finally architecte in French is a big insult at that point, because they've got a terrible building in immediate post-war Europe. And his equivalent in the English is bastard, idiot, critic. So that's the biggest, that's the final
This is as
death
bad as
below.
it gets, yes.
I'll try and weave in a little bit, and I'll try and take a slightly different perspective, just because I'm trying to speak from a different position. I've been asked, since this final volume of the Beckett Letters is coming out now, by the journalists at the Sunday Times and the Irish Times, to give me newsworthy stories that they can then print as part of the news. And I'm lost. I just don't know what a newsworthy story would be about Samuel Beckett in the last 30 years of his life. He won the Nobel Prize, but you already know that. They want something new. The new things that go on in a writer's life are usually, if they're a writer of fiction, internal processes. And that's not something that usually makes the headlines in newspapers. But of course, it has got a place in the arts pages. So my slightly different perspective, I was thinking it would be more different because there'd be four of us panelists, would be to just say a word or two from what we could call the academic point of view. Not that my colleagues are not academics in their own way, but I'm perhaps the one university-affiliated academic. And what I'd say is a bit what they've already said, that the academic perspective, if it offers anything, and this too is under challenge, it should be something like the equivalent of slow food, I think. as opposed to fast food,
Yes,
which journalists
yes, yes,
almost
yes.
necessarily have to produce. It doesn't mean to say it's not good, but it does have to come out fast. Academic criticism should be allowed to be fairly slow. We're all used to the idea that criticism involves recognition and assessment of the latest work of poetry, fiction, theatre, dance, whatever. But the work of the critic, or let's say perhaps of the academic critic, often starts before the completed work is received. One of the jobs of the academic critic is indeed to ensure that the works which are studied, commented on, praised, derided, emulated, are as good as they can possibly be. And by that I mean as close to the author's intentions usually as that could possibly come. And I can give you an example from the experience I've been citing from my 25 years of working on Beckett. I don't know if you can show an image. Someone said they would show me if you can show some.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what a Samuel Beckett letter looks like, and you could just run through them.
quite easy to read.
Yeah, just next image. And just keep on going, just show a few. Yes, the blessed arrival of a
I
typeface.
couldn't find page 6, he said.
And that's what it turns into in our text. So as you can see here, when we print this, it appears as we transcribe, we translate, and we give explanatory notes. It might seem like that's a rather mechanical sort of exercise to be called criticism, but I think that is also criticism: transcription, translation, annotation. Just like the endeavour to write serious criticism, these activities call upon all your resources. What Rosemary's been describing, our knowledge, in this case the knowledge of the 5 or 6 languages that Samuel Beckett wrote fairly comfortably. And just to turn handwriting into print is a massive task when it's as difficult as that. Translation too, as it's often been remarked, is perhaps the most careful form of reading. If any of you have translated, you'll know that you've seen things that you just didn't see before. And so that too is a form, I would like to say, of criticism. Selection requires one, since we're publishing a selected edition, requires a very fine calibration of what you think is better, what value is as against the value of another letter. And annotation requires you to have a very clear sense, often disputed with my colleagues, fellow editors, of who your reader is. How much can you expect them to know? So academic criticism is also dealing with an audience, but in a slightly different way. So the job of an academic critic, it seems to me, is often one of preparation or indeed of preservation of texts which would otherwise be falling out of the public view. And this is a million miles from what academics are increasingly being asked to do by government forces, which is with their notion of impact, which is basically to enter, in my view, very often prematurely, the public sphere and to show off what you're doing, basically to try and almost replace journalists. That is not what we're best at usually, rather the slow process that allows us to see value emerge. And lest this sort of criticism appear too distant from what my colleagues have been discussing, let me just mention how I got involved in this process of editing the Beckett letters. In the late 1980s, I became friends in Paris with a woman called Catherine Carver. You won't have heard of her because she was a great editor. Okay? She had been the editor of such writers as Leonard Cohen, Ken Kesey, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark, among many others. Flannery O'Connor said she wouldn't move publisher unless Catherine Carver moved with her. Now, the reason you haven't heard of her is because that was how she saw her role. She absolutely forbade that her name appear anywhere. That too is a form of criticism, and I think it's a form of criticism that I would really, if any of your budding critics, encourage you to practice your hand at. This too is required of the critic, and I think it's going to be increasingly inquired as creative writing takes a more and more prominent place in the university. We have to learn how to take a fledgling text and turn it into something better than it already is, and to do that without adding something of yourself. And that's immensely difficult, to bring out the quality of a work and allow it to flourish. That's what Catherine Carver, she had this ability to a sort of extraordinary degree, which is why all her writers became dependent upon her. She was an éminence grise, an éminemment grise. She really did not want to be seen. So again, the push for the academic or the behind-the-scenes critic towards the public is not really in the I don't think it's in the favor of creative writers at the moment. My own attempt to emulate Catherine, to learn from her, has come out this series that I think maybe Alan mentioned I run, called the Cahiers series. And we're now, this number 28, 7, 8, and 9 are about to be published. One of them's Kirsty Gunn, one of them's Javier Marias, and the other one, a Bulgarian writer. What I do is I have to get about maximum of 10,000 words to work in this particular form, which includes images. And usually I encourage a writer to send me much more, and then I try and edit it down. That too is criticism. And if you want to become a good literary critic of the kind that my colleagues have been talking about, try your hand on not just your own writing, because that's the most difficult, because of course it seems good to you, or it's as good as it can be, but try it on your colleagues. Build groups of friends whereby you pull apart each other's work and you try to help them express themselves in the best possible way. I think that's also one of the paths to becoming a good public literary critic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Well, bear in mind that this is the first such session at the Edinburgh Book Festival in its entire history, I think. You know, so an hour in 30 years. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. And if there's people with sort of passionate things to say or questions they want to ask, don't wait for the lights to go up. Just put your hands up, and we'll try and incorporate it as we go along, because we don't have that long, really. I mean, what we're really interested here, though, in this project that we're talking about, is finding new and young critics. And, you know, what we're getting with the internet in particular is that people have the opportunity to write something and then make it public. And what you are suggesting, I think all three are suggesting, is that there is no intermediary then. And this intermediary is an important person in that process.
One of the problems, I think, is that we're in a period of popular culture where the idea of quality or the exceptional is regarded with kind of suspicion. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, people talk about post-thought politics, that it's boring to say, well, he or she knows something, therefore is worth listening to. It's much better just to scream abuse, or to say, I have got a view. And one of the difficulties when you're dealing with things that are worthwhile and you're trying to argue why they are worthwhile is that you also just have to make the case for this being good, worthwhile, you know, something that matters, the book. And that's why, you know, my anxiety about a simple space in newspapers, although, you know, clearly newspaper readership is on a very steep decline, and people are getting their information from other places, and they can find some of that there. But there was something wonderful about the newspaper that would give you the package.
Yes, absolutely.
So you would buy it maybe because you wanted to, you know, read a very good sports writer. But at the same time, as a consequence, you would read 2 very good books pages. And the difficulty is in replacing that complete package where you're being invited into territory that you otherwise didn't know. And I think what you've got to fight against, what people have got to fight against as much as anything in this whole field, is the kind of the growth of a sort of Philistine culture where, you know, you just accept that if it sells, it's good. If it's good entertainment, it's good. And, you know, I'm the last person to be against good entertainment. But that the exceptional, the different, the thing that requires time and the thing that requires work, really, do you have enough time to do that? No, move on to something quick. That's the thing you've got to fight against before you even get into the idea
There's a
of proper
gentleman
discrimination.
behind here, and there's one in the front here, so we could just quickly take these questions, and maybe both. There's a gentleman behind, and the gentleman.
Oh,
very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, panelists. I'm going to make 2 assertions, and I'd like comments on them. One is that I don't really think there is a dearth, far less a death, of critics. I think, and you have alluded to that, Mr. Naughty, a major erosion of trust. The word critic means to judge. If you don't trust the judges, you're not going to read them. The second assertion I'd like to make is that there is a great deal of discussion going on between people face-to-face these days, not just on the internet. Down the pub, you might call it localism. And that gets discussed between people every day. So there's that element of it as well.
okay. Well, that's it. Just on the point about trust, were critics as a breed ever trusted? I don't think so. I mean,
Not by the people that were criticising, that's for sure.
No, exactly. And but I mean, I think that the dropping of the stone into the pond of water and all the ripples and all the discussions that follow from that is what it's about. And I mean, even if you're talking like people about Shaw and so on, you wouldn't say that somebody like that was necessarily likable. I personally think an evening with George Bernard Shaw would have been one of the most horrible evenings you could imagine.
Well, he was a vegetarian.
But
he was not a teetotaler as well.
But I mean, I don't think likability or and then trust is the issue. I mean, okay, if there are people writing rubbish and writing things that suggest that pieces of work are magical and wonderful, and you go and see them and realise they're completely empty, and that's beyond argument, then you might not trust them again, of course. But I don't think lack of trust is the problem.
I think also you were alluding earlier to politics. I mean, Michael Gove said, people don't like experts, they're fed up with experts and so on. There's an element of that, I think, maybe that you're tapping into there, that people don't like the idea that there are people who consider themselves to have some kind of authority. And people get very riled at that, particularly now that there's the idea that everybody's opinion is as valid as anybody else's.
Yes, exactly.
And on a certain level, that's absolutely true. But I know that, if you were having your house surveyed, you'd rather it was surveyed by somebody who had kind of gone through a process of learning what makes for a good house and for difficult foundations and so on. It's not a terribly good analogy, but I think that people who have read for most of their lives and are in the business of thinking hard and analysing hard, they are worth listening to. Some citizen critics are absolutely worth listening to, but you need to know the kind of reviewer that you're reading in order to know the level of trust you can maybe put in them. Having said which, very quickly, in my own life, there are very few people whose judgment about books I actually trust. I will read a book that someone's recommended and often actually not agree with them.
Well,
but
quite
that's
often if somebody says it's rubbish, you think, I'm going to read this because
Yes.
I like it. Because that person.
When I worked in a public library, the most popular shelf in the library was the returned bookshelf. So if another reader had read it, somebody always borrowed it. This gentleman here, and there's a gentleman at the top there in the fetching braces.
Picking up Rosemary's point about competence, I had the great pleasure of working with Alan Wright, Andy Young from the Glasgow Herald when they came through for the festivals, and Kaya. Yeah. And on one occasion, I was able to take the three of them to Glamis Castle for Judi Dench and Michael Williams being filmed by the BBC. They were marvelous companions. And one good reason why they were marvelous companions, I trusted their views. They had seen repertory company with people like Duncan McRae, who'd worked up in the boards to the positions they finally occupied, and they could refer back to very great competence. To finalize, I went on one wine trip. This question, doesn't commercialism come into it, like it's come in too much to sport? And the gentleman I was traveling with, it was from London, Stan said, Belgium to Bulgaria, and he said, you're in Scotland, could you speak to the Scotsman? My column has been reduced on wine to a minimum because two fat ladies have crept across the page. And there is an element at that point where it was a wine list. Nobody was being educated, and the question of trust came in. Isn't it a pity now that we don't have trust, to come back to the initial point, because the audience don't necessarily have, like many of the old-time reviewers, the competence to judge a whole gamut of acting skills.
Could you pass that up to the gentleman up there as well? Maybe
completely agree.
You can have a word with us. I'd also like, in the meantime, Dan, to ask you about what your students are like, what their approach to criticism is. I mean, are they interested in criticism?
I teach in a very slightly eccentric place, so with a very international audience, so I can still draw on a degree of I'd call it transference or sort of interest in culture, particularly from Eastern Bloc countries, for example, where there's still a great respect for culture compared with what we might have here. But I also teach a lot of Americans, and some are very good, some are not so good. But what I think my academic perspective and what my colleagues are saying is there's a terror of evaluation that is entering academia at the moment. In fact, it's very thoroughly in America. I spoke to a very senior professor, though young senior professor from Stanford. So one of the most, an Ivy League, super privileged, fantastic salary, no doubt, he in this university. and he was trying to teach a basic sort of history of civilization, great books. The students, first-year students, were up in arms, going to their dean saying, "You have no right to teach Plato. This is a kind of culture of slavery. You have no right to teach Aphra Behn. You're not a woman. You have no right," literally, and they were being heard by the dean. It's not that these students might have come in with these views, but the dean was taking it seriously. And there was committees about it, and he said, "I didn't teach anything. I was just basically sort of managing this."
Yeah.
And so this is identity politics coming from America, and it's penetrating here. So
There's no need to be, don't be too depressed.
Sorry, no, I'm just getting,
I've
don't
got-
read
calm-
Moby Dick because a whale gets killed. I mean, for God's sake.
I've got
Well, it's a very
colleagues-
upsetting scene, actually.
Yes, yeah. It does go on a bit.
There's a gentleman up here and there's a gentleman. Well, there's too many gentlemen, and not enough women and not enough young people. Henceforth, be asking for people under the age of 35.
We've heard of Beckett's term of abuse, critics as a term of abuse. But what about the abuse of criticism that's seen, for example, on the Amazon pages? So 5 stars, the book arrived before you said it would, 5 stars.
Yes.
Or the Orlando Feige's crisis of abusing fellow writers to promote his own book. What are the views of the panel on those things?
Okay, do you want to say something about that, Rosemary? It's James.
Well, yes, one thing that I know as a writer, I don't ever look at the Amazon reviews of my books because there are so many. My sister phoned up one day to say, "Don't look on Amazon." Well, of course,
Yes,
you wanted to.
yes,
She said,
yes.
because I think there's somebody who doesn't like you, because it didn't read just like a review of somebody who just hadn't liked the book, but they obviously hadn't liked a review I'd written of their book. And if it's anonymous reviewing, my view is don't pay any attention to it. If somebody doesn't put their name to it, it's really not worth reading because it's usually it's anonymous for a reason.
Well, it's TripAdvisor, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. You can't know
Well,
the next
I use
person that's
TripAdvisor.
read.
I find it quite helpful at times,
Yes.
At times.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Have you looked at Amazon?
Yeah, I did look. I have the honour of having. This is the worst book I have ever read. Really. So I thought,
A
well,
friend.
That's a distinction.
at least it was a distinction. I thought that's pretty good going. Again, I think it's what we're addressing there is what Jim was talking about. It's the middle ground or the middle man or woman, that institution that you could recognise and more or less trust. Traditionally, a newspaper. That you would think, well, the person that is going to be employed by this newspaper is likely to have some experience and some views.
Well,
and now it's open forum, and I don't see a way back from that. But it is very, very unsettling, and you've got to find the 1 or 2 critics that you really trust. And I mean, there's still things like the London Review Books, the TLS, where they don't, you have to have a certain pedigree, I think.
Scottish
probably.
Review of Books, you meant.
Well,
You
absolutely.
neglected to mention it, yeah.
Absolutely.
But the other thing, Dan,
Sorry.
about that, no, exactly on this point, is that when there was a kind of common consumption of admittedly a fairly small core of papers, magazines, which people would generally all read, then if there was a review of something that made a remarkable point, whether it's a piece of drama or a book or a piece of music or a performance or a performer, then it would become a matter of discussion. It wouldn't be a question of whether you agreed or disagreed with the person, but everybody would sort of take a view on it. Now, the thing is so disparate and so difficult to bring together that kind of common discussion is something we're losing. And I don't think there's any way of turning a switch and bringing it back, but I think it's regrettable, and it's one of the reasons why you'll get people turning to, the sort of Amazon reviews, some of which could be malicious, some of which could be by the author himself or herself, and generally speaking, useless. And also the commercially driven reviews, so-called.
Read this review
which-
and buy the book.
Yeah, which lose all the proper imprimatur of, an individual, perhaps bravely, occasionally maliciously, but perhaps bravely taking a view and defending it. And when you start to be unable to distinguish between a review that's written from that perspective, with all the kind of discipline and the commitment that's involved, and one which is a piece of commercial rubbish, it all gets a bit depressing and difficult.
Right. I think there's a gentleman up there with there and a lady, and there's a gentleman over here. So you're still having trouble with this, with due respect to the lady.
I'm happy to defer.
Oh, you're happy to defer? Are you? Goodness gracious. Yeah. Brownie points there, that's for sure.
A distinguished novelist handing away
very
the microphone.
gracious,
My
very
goodness.
gracious. Nobody, I mean, with the exception of Dan, I think it's interesting, nobody's mentioned the academy and academic criticism. And when you think of all the books that are published and the academic articles which are the slow food, as you said, of criticism, I just wondered, do you think that these are completely irrelevant? I mean, after all, students are reading them, often teachers are reading them and using them in, you know, with school students and so on. So there is a kind of slow food way in which considered and objective criticism, objective as much as it can be, is available and does, in a sense, counter the ghastliness of the Amazon review.
Can you go?
Ideally, an academic critic should be objective, or at least, let's say, disinterested, because they have a salary. So they're not actually having to do this for their bread and butter. This is something extra that they do. This is no longer the case. If you're in a department and it's about to be up for the REF, that's the research exercise, you know you have to publish a certain number of articles. And these are, so you're also a hired hand. There's no disinterest anymore in the academy. I have a friend who is going for promotion and working in literature, but no, they gave the promotion to someone whose specialty is slasher movies. I mean, fair enough, maybe there's important books to be written about slasher movies, but this willingness to see everything on the same level is really a problem, I think, at the moment in academia. Given that it always a lot of what starts in America comes here in a big way. We're going to see more and more of that. So I fear that academics are not given quite the space and liberty that one might hope for that they were in the past.
Just an addendum. I'm not going to interrupt.
One other little point is that academics, to make their career traditionally, were obliged or expected to publish a monograph. That would be the sign that you'd more or less, or at least got going on the academic ladder. Now, the problem with monographs is that publishers are reluctant to publish them these days because the very universities that require their academics to publish monographs, their libraries don't buy the monographs. So there's the problem. As a young academic, you were expected to publish a monograph which the publisher doesn't want to publish because no one's going to buy it, not even the university library.
I like the slow food analogy very much. And you know, there's an addendum to that, really, which is about the, I think, pretty disgraceful performance of many publishers, not all of them. And in Scotland, as we all know, there are a lot of small publishers really doing very good things in publishing lost work, you know, back copies of things that have been lost for a long time. And you only have to look at the Man Booker long list to see that what small publishers are doing is often very good. But the big publishers, driven by, you know, remorseless commercial pressure, and we know what's happened to the publishing industry in this country in terms of the few people who basically run the guts of it, they will not allow a book to fly. So a book comes out, and if in 3 weeks it hasn't started to, you know, do something at Waterstones, that's it. You know, it's more or less pulped. And the idea of, you know, an old, you know, Snipcock and Tweed sitting in Bedford Square, keeping the backlist of a novelist going on the grounds that, you know, every year 1,500 copies were sold.
Eventually.
That whole idea of the way that the literary world operated is in danger of going. I mean, in drama, actually, it's not nearly so bad, because if you look at the great companies in the UK, they're doing really, really extraordinary work, I think, probably better than they were 30 years ago. But in publishing, this idea that a book gets one moment, and if it's eclipsed by something else that happens to come out the same week, oh, well, forget it, tough. And it's not allowed to have a proper life.
The theatre companies are publicly funded usually, and the publishers aren't.
Yes.
I may be the wrong demographic, but I hope
you are definitely.
Splendid.
But I hope my comment will counter that. I'd like to speak up partly for what the Herald is doing with their young critics, and a number of people here may not be aware that alongside the festival reviews, there are ones by young critics which are very good, a lot of them. And also, I'd like to mention the Scottish Review, which is an online magazine which does encourage young people through its Young Scotland programme, now spread across the UK, and that will be encouraging young critical minds into that forum.
Thank you. Yeah. And yes, excellent. Wait, you'll get your shot in a second, I swear. No, you've just walked past.
Because I'm female and I used to be 35.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. Yeah. I don't mind. We've got to be,
I want to question this idea that seems to be building up that there was a golden age. I think there's a reason why criticism declined. I think this should be called the suicide of the critic, because critics got to a stage where they were just talking to each other. And very often, particularly in non-fiction reviewing, the review would be more about the reviewer and his studies than the book they were supposed to be discussing. It still exists in radio criticism, which we haven't heard anything about. If you turn on after the beginning of the program, you could be forgiven for thinking you're listening to a comedy program. And just as you've got that exclusivity in high-end reviewing, you've also got it on the internet, where if you look up a review of something that's a cult thing, you can't understand what the people are talking about because there are so many references to people you've never heard of that the whole thing's meaningless.
Absolutely. This lady up here, could we? I'm completely dumbfounded by slasher movies. Is it something to do with haberdashery or something like that? Yeah.
I was wondering what you were going to say then.
Thanks for letting me speak. I am not only American and female, I'm over 35, but I also work in academia.
Well,
I do not have tenure. I'm not a faculty member, but my husband is, and I do teach at a university. And I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit. I think everything you've said is true, but I'm not as pessimistic as you are, because what I have seen in the United States is a real emphasis on small publishers and regional presses. And I think a lot of us have sort of turned over our trust to those kinds of venues, and also to festivals like this, so that we trust the festival organizers to sort of say, here's who you need to be reading. And I don't know where the critic, where your role would fit with that kind of thing, but
it's a very interesting point you make about festivals. I mean, this is now a rather it's such an obvious point that everybody agrees with. It can be made very briefly. But book festivals in the last 20 years, and we know there are some that are very good and some that are very bad and a lot in between. But book festivals have become discussion forums, for, not just for books, but for all kinds of things, current events, politics, and so on. And have given a kind of voice to people, or a communal, a space for people to come in vast numbers, not just in Edinburgh, to talk about things. And in a way, they've become a kind of engine of the discussion of the common cultural interests that we've been talking about, that, used to happen, and still, of course, still happens, you're right, in newspaper pages, but in a much diminished form. And I think book festivals like this one have done an amazing thing, actually, in bringing people in, not just to talk about pieces of literature, but general ideas about how the culture is faring politically and artistically.
Very interesting point you make about the flourishing of small publishers, because coming back to the issue of trust, when I have 250 books a week to go through, there are publishers that you learn to trust, and often they're very small publishers, but you think, this is not an author I've heard of, but I know that the editorial judgment of this company has been very good. Occasionally it's patchy, but it's really worth taking a punt, putting this book out for review. So that's an excellent point, I would say.
I don't want to be pessimistic about the academe either. I absolutely agree with you. I think, obviously I've set up this enterprise to publish things. There are lots of interesting things going on. It's just that, as Jim sort of first said, we're looking for new sources of authority. It might be a new publishing house with a very good editorial board. It might be one or two of the traditional print media, the ones that you're part of. Perhaps we're privileged in Scotland to have more of that than in England. But we are really in sort of looking for our ways. And partly, if you're a budding critic, find the critic you like and read everything that they write. I mean, I know if I have some differences with him, but I know if James Wood praises a book, it's likely to be pretty good. He's much better at damning. He's an expert dammer, so I don't always agree with him. If I read Gabriel Josephici, if he likes a book, I know it's going to be worth reading.
Yeah.
If I read Michael Hoffman, I love to see him take people apart. There are still some reviewers that are just real. You can follow, and you can sort of begin to trust their judgment. In the cinema world, I always read Peter Bradshaw. I don't always agree with him, but I know that if he says something, it's worth.
Okay.
So finding your person is very important.
You're basically a sadist, aren't you? You're like this kind of... James.
Yeah, I deferred, but now I'm back. Could you, the point about radio radio reviewing and so on was mentioned. I wondered if you could all speak briefly about the fact that in the place, the political and cultural place we are now, Scotland, we've had to develop, sometimes against a metropolitan bias, our own rounded kind of criticism. But it's distinctly absent from, for example, Radio Scotland, which does absolutely nothing to do with books that I'm aware of, apart from a very small section of the Janice for Science show. No harm to Janice, but that seems to me there's a complete institutional lack of desire or ambition in some of our own homegrown institutions. Scottish Review of Books is an exception, but there's a big gap there, and I wonder how we can address it.
Well, imagine the Pips are about to go.
Right,
yes,
okay.
They are about to go. Yeah?
No, James, I mean, you're absolutely right, but I think where you say we want to develop a rounded critical...
you can each have a quick say.
What do we call it? You know, sphere in Scotland. One of the difficulties, I think, is that it's been almost hijacked by the big political question. So people find themselves on one side or the other, in favour or not in favour. And even if they aren't, and even if they've got actually no interest in the question, difficult thing to imagine, but even if they haven't, it's assumed that they have and they're not saying it. Yeah. And I think that's a real difficulty.
Okay, quickly,
I mean, there's nothing we can do about it at the moment, but I think it's there.
Quickly.
Just in terms of books coverage on radio, I just get the feeling that they don't think they've found a way of doing it that's exciting enough. I think it's very, they see that the discussion of books isn't in itself interesting enough. And I think that goes for television as well. And
although,
but they have great TV programs in France and the radio for books, Apostrophe, etc. Yeah, very high. Radio 4 is full of
Radio
books.
4 is full of books, yes.
And listen, I mean, I do a book club program once a month on Radio 4, which has got an audience. I mean, at 4:30 in the. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit
I've got a book actually just out. I'll give you it now.
Thank you very much.
Quite like to
but I mean,
it while we're here,
4:30 on a Sunday afternoon, 1 million listeners. I mean, that's remarkable. Now, that's with an author. Yes. But an author facing questions. But I mean, the idea that there isn't an appetite for discussion about what makes this work, is it good, is it bad, will I want to read it, is absurd. Of course there's an appetite there. And incidentally, I'm not that pessimistic as I sounded.
Sessions from here should be broadcast on Radio
You can say if he's pessimistic, it doesn't matter.
Not? It's...
I think that, as you were saying, your academic aim high. If you're young and aiming for a future in this world of commenting on the arts, working again on Beckett, in the late 1950s, when he put on his first radio play, Barbara Bray was the person who commissioned him or worked with the BBC. They were putting on full-length plays in French on the third programme, and people listened to them. So a lot of it's to do with don't underestimate your audience. That's what Jim's saying as well. Right. If you do something good and it's interesting, it doesn't have to be glitzy. It can engage people. There is a future there.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to our three panelists, Rosemary, Dan, and Jim, for sharing their thoughts with us. I should add that if you want to become a critic or are interested in getting involved in this project, read the Scottish Review of Books, latest issue. Or
keeps coming up, that, doesn't it?
I know, but what can one do? Or ScottishReviewOfBooks.org, because we operate in cyberspace as well. And I thought I should end with a quote from a critic I liked very much, who influenced a lot of my kind of thinking about criticism and viewing, etc. Kenneth Tynan, the enfant terrible, who was a great reviewer of the Edinburgh Festival, for example. He said, "A critic is a man who knows the way but can't drive the car." And that really probably sums me up pretty well, I think. These authors, by the way, have books at this book festival. There's no signing here, but I dare say if you find their books and find them, they might actually be persuaded for a shilling to sign them. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.